Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ziad Asali, the American Task Force on Palestine. Welcome to Palestinian-Israeli war in a changing regional landscape. This panel has been sponsored by ATFP Board Member Amin Sutiya, and we thank him for that. Hostilities are not the optimal moment to discuss issues reasonably and with an expectation of a dispassionate response. But those of us who are serious about peace and about putting an end to this conflict once and for all, so we do not have to come up with crises like this every couple of years to dissect and analyze and end up where we started, requires that we speak honestly and bring up ideas and contribute to the solution and not the problems. We will strive to do that. We at ATFP are not dispassionate, but we are committed to a viable solution, Palestine alongside Israel, to bring once and all this already too old of a conflict. Let me start out by saying that we are indubitably in support of a ceasefire today, this hour, this minute, if it can be done. What separates us from the real deal that will be signed about a ceasefire is just the number of deaths and the destruction that will occur till that ceasefire takes place. We want to thank here Egypt, the patron of peace for a long, long time, who has played this role over and over again. Let us hope that the role it plays now will lead to a serious conversation and a serious political commitment on all parties to resume the discussion about the underlying conflict that has caused this to recur in an eruption every now and then, with a regularity that is frankly disgusting. We are dealing with issues of occupation, issues of blockade, issues of extremism, issues of riding tides of passion that generates blood, which asks for revenge and more blood. It cannot be separated. What is happening today cannot be separated from the underlying causes. We at ATFP have decided to do something different this time, which is to have our own panel with our own experts that reflect collectively our own points of view. We're not apologetic. We're not dispassionate. We are purposive in pursuing a solution to this crisis as well as we do to the general underlying issues. For this, we have chosen panelists of our own. We are going to be dealing with the humanitarian crisis, and for that we have Dr. Saliba Sarsar, Professor Sarsar. We also have to deal with the political realities on a granular and dynamic level of what is happening in Palestine and Israel at this time, and hopefully where it is going to go. And we have Ghaith Al-Omari, our Executive Director, who's an old hand at this issue. Lastly, we have Hussein Ibish to put this present crisis and the whole issue in a regional context, a changing political landscape that will not necessarily mean that this round will be just exactly like the previous rounds. We could not find somebody more qualified than in our own house, Hussein Ibish. We have their introductions and their statements in your possession, I believe, and I just want to start in that order as I present the panelists. Professor Sarsar would be the first to start, and we're looking forward to his presentation. Everyone will have 5 minutes. We'll be generous perhaps by 1 or 2 minutes beyond. I appreciate your indulgence. And we'll ask questions of each presenter, and then we'll have some discussion at the dais here and open it up for a general discussion. You're all welcome to prepare your questions. We will stick to the timeline and hope to finish exactly by 2 o'clock. We plan to finish by 2 o'clock. Some panelists have to leave just before that, and we ask for your indulgence about that. So without further ado, and with much discussion to come, let me present to you Professor Saliba Sarsar.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And it's an honor to be with you today and to share some ideas about what is going on. I will read a prepared statement, which I did the last couple of days, more talking about the general sense of what I believe is going on, and then I'll be more than happy to answer questions. The world watches with pain and sorrow as the Israel-Hamas war rages on, generating death, destruction, and more enemies on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian divide. The violence violates international humanitarian law and international human rights laws and must be stopped. Talks of a ceasefire and intermediaries abound, but so are the claims and counterclaims of the warring parties. Long before I met my wife, Hiyam, when I was 11 and she was 4, we experienced the battle for Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. We still remember the fear of the night and day and the anxiety that gripped our parents as they attempted to protect us from harm. Although our plight paled in comparison to those of others, 2 of my neighbors lost their lives in that war. The memory of war persists. During the 1990-91 First Gulf War, like most Israelis and Palestinians, my wife, before she became my wife, also faced the danger of Scud missiles launched by Saddam Hussein's Iraq against Israel. With a gas mask in hand, every time the siren sounded, she ushered her entire family into a safe room, taped the door shut, and prayed until the clear signal was given. It is déjà vu again. However, while Israel is prepared for emergencies, the people of Gaza have no sirens, no shelters, no iron domes. Some, if lucky, are given a few minutes to evacuate their homes before these are hit and destroyed. The death or injury of a single life is unacceptable, let alone the 222 plus dead and over 1,600 wounded in Gaza, as well as the 1 killed in Israel and 20 plus wounded there. We ask, why war? Why do we continually fall prey to the temptations of power and cause sufferings to ourselves and to others? Rarely listening to the voice of wisdom or doing the right thing, why do we often forget or ignore the true lessons of war and the day after? War results from the failure of deterrence and diplomacy. Peace is born by preparing for it. The responsibility and credit for peace must rest with all of us. The current Israel-Hamas war, similar to those of 2008, 2009, and then 2012, illustrate, and even though wars are planned to achieve specific goals, once initiated, such wars, whether or not they are declared justified or costly, usually take on a life of their own, changing reality in unforeseen ways and violating the innocent especially. No matter how strong the defenses against war are, the cost of war is always high. Once the fighting begins, winning becomes primary and an end in itself, reducing peacemaking and peace-building to secondary roles. Once war aims are met, although they rarely are, war termination, if not preceded and followed by thoughtful economic, political, security strategies and actions, they become a spark for another war. The passion for revenge has deep roots in the human psyche. We need to go beyond victory and defeat. The Israel-Hamas war will end, hopefully sooner than later. Both sides must realize that in war, society becomes hostage to and victim of fear and the unknown, and that there are better ways to resolve conflict than through aggression and violence. Israelis and Palestinians have an obligation to reach a peace settlement. However, a dictated peace is short-lived, while a collaborative peace is sustaining and sustainable. Most fair-minded observers agree that while Israel, like any other country, is entitled to self-defense and security, the Palestinians are entitled to their independence and statehood. However, while national self-defense and self-determination are legitimate goals, they must not be used to endanger others. While one's security is equally important for survival, that security must be balanced with the security of the other. Otherwise, security of one generates insecurity for the other, leading to fear, aggression, and death. The Hamas shelling of Israeli cities must end. Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands must end. And normal relations must be established between Israel and Palestine. The real solution rests with two sovereign states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. The United States' role is essential. It seems that both Israelis and Palestinians are unable or unwilling to reach agreement on their own. The American administration is strongly urged to exert its positive influence in support of this important national and human security goal. Focusing immediately on ending this Israel-Gaza crisis should be on top of the agenda. This should be followed by reconstruction given the dire needs of the population in Gaza and elsewhere. Stabilizing the Gaza issue might even contribute to the success of an overall peace strategy between the Palestinians and Israel. It is in America's national interest to advocate for and secure a state of Palestine living alongside the state of Israel. It is in the national interest of the Palestinians to wage peace for and in pursuit of their state. It is in Israel's national interest to work hard for the creation of a state of Palestine. Security and a stable peace result from peace, not expansion and settlement. What is needed is a shared vision of peace, supported by a strong political will and dedicated engagement by all parties concerned. Wisdom necessitates making the resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict a priority now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saliba. It's not often that I share the podium with a fellow Jerusalemite, even one who comes from my own neighborhood, and a member of the ATFP board. Saliba, I want to ask you a rather larger question, which is the clash of the narratives which drives the present conflict, at least in the minds of the people, is not a new phenomenon. The world is full of troubled areas where people have clashed over their own history and their lands. Many have found solutions to these problems in the world, in recent times even, after conflicts that lasted for centuries. What can you say about those who have indeed found a way out of the clash of narratives and landscape as that might apply to what the Palestinians and the Israelis can do to get over this and find a way to an accommodation?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
it's an excellent question, and obviously it can be answered in so many ways, and it's extensive. But we know that there was an Irish problem, and there was a South African problem, and there are problems that evolved over history between the Germans and the Jews, and between neighbors. And many of them have found a way to embrace the other, even though that embrace is not full, yet they have found a way to empathize. And I want to commend here Tala Haikal in your office, who has written a wonderful article called Empathy is Essential to Humanity, which was published last week in the Huffington Post. Empathy and compassion are essential, and they are found in all kinds of values, religious and otherwise. And if people just get to understand the other and tell a story and embrace that story without making all kinds of judgments, they can really come up with a narrative. Now, the difficulty is, do you come up with a dual narrative where people can understand both, or do you come up with a combined narrative where it becomes one history? Just let me conclude with a very important example. Two of my colleagues, one who is doing well and alive, but the other who have passed away, one Palestinian and one Israeli, they came out with a series of booklets and a book called Side by Side, whereby they present the Israeli narrative, the Palestinian narrative, and they leave a middle column open for students to write some type of combination. And this was a very successful model that was published. The book is called Side by Side, if anybody is interested. I don't work for the publisher. And that book, in a way, has created a strong effort to bring Israeli teachers and academics and Palestinian teachers, academics, put them together over a 5-year period, each of them writing his or her history, and then creating that dual narrative. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is they went to the Israeli authorities and they went to the Palestinian authorities to say, please let us teach this. And they turned them down. And so now some of the teachers use it as supplementary text to indicate that there is a bridge, and that bridge needs to be worked on. And all of us are responsible to develop that dual or combined narrative so that we can appreciate the other and not superimpose on the other our own judgment and our own history. Without that empathy, without that compassion, without reaching out to the other, it is impossible to develop that. So I am urging that we look deeply into this issue as we go along.
Thank you again, Saliba. For the next segment, we are going to discuss the dynamics and the granularity of what really is going on now and what is expected to evolve. And for that, there are few people in Washington, in fact, beyond Washington, who are better qualified than our next presenter, our friend and our Executive Director, Ghaith Al-Omari.
Thank you, Ziad, and thank you all for being here. And before I begin, I must apologize. I will have to leave 15 minutes before it ends. Long-standing commitment. If I learned anything in this business, it is developments on the ground sadly often interfere with our best laid plans, but you know, I have these plans. As Ziad said, I will talk about dynamics, about the political dynamics, and it will be maybe dispassionate and analytical, but I cannot start without first pointing that first and foremost, there is a humanitarian element. And it is the overriding element, as both Ziad and Saliba said. People are dying, livelihoods are being shattered, and the first priority right now is to end the violence. And in that regard, I would like to echo the statements of Sameh Shukri, the Egyptian foreign minister, who basically said that no one should use and play around with people's lives for political gains, which sadly is often the case in these situations. Today we are, in my view, entering... Here, I'm going to start my 5 minutes now. Today we are...
No bonus for you.
Today I think, barring any unexpected major developments on the ground, and this is not a small caveat, by the way, because in these situations, things are often led by the ground, not by high policy. But barring anything major, we're entering, I think, the last minute posturing towards a ceasefire, a process that was started with the Egyptian ceasefire proposal a few days ago that was, unsurprisingly rejected. But now we're getting into the kind of posturing moment where everyone's trying to get to enhance their position before this deal is struck. I will focus on the Palestinian domestic dynamics, but I will start maybe with a political observation about Israel. We're seeing a very interesting dynamics in the Israeli right, in particular. When Prime Minister Netanyahu feels that he has to fire his deputy prime minister, who is a very senior member of Likud, and has to go on a very thinly veiled criticism of his foreign minister, then we see a dynamic in the right that I think will not stop once the hostilities end. And I see a period of instability in Israeli politics leading to possibly Israeli elections. On the Palestinian side, there are really two main players I want to focus on, Hamas and the PA/President Abbas. For Hamas, I would say their objectives in the current operation today there are three objectives. The first and most important, perhaps, is to emerge in a way that will allow them to claim victory. And that can happen in one of two ways. Either by doing a spectacular military operation. We've seen them try to do some new qualitative, quote-unquote, operations, amphibian attacks, tunnels, drones, etc. And so far they have failed. But they need one of those to say that we have re-established deterrence with Israel. The other one, of course, is to emerge with a ceasefire that gives them something more. And so far they have also failed. The Egyptian ceasefire proposal did not give them anything more than they got in 2012, probably even less. The second objective is to get Egypt to address them and engage them as a primary address in Gaza, which Egypt has consistently refused to do over the last year. The last flare-up of violence, we saw Egypt bypass them and directly engage Islamic Jihad. They're trying to, again, become the address, and that's why when the Egyptians formulated and rolled out the ceasefire proposal, they very specifically, not hastily, not oversight, but very specifically decided not to elevate Hamas to the major address, but rather unrolled the proposal primarily through the media. Third objective is to give an in to the regional patrons, Qatar and Turkey, who both have been marginalized in the recent regional developments, particularly for Qatar. And in that regard, Hamas is trying to bring in those sponsors as brokers in the ceasefire. Again, this has not happened, primarily because of the global consensus. And the Americans led this in terms of putting their backing behind the Egyptian initiative. So far, Hamas has not gotten any of its objectives, and that's why it has refused the Egyptian proposal. Today, we see Hamas leadership united under fire, which is natural. Yet also the tensions that have plagued it for a while are seen bubbling under the surface. And I suspect once the dust settles, these tensions will come back to the forefront. In terms of the PA, Fatah, President Abbas, we have to keep in mind that when the hostilities started, they have entered this phase already shaken. This came after the period of the kidnapping and murder of the 3 Israeli teenagers, followed by the murder of the Palestinian teenager in Jerusalem, during which time the PA endured a lot of internal criticism for security cooperation with Israel, etc. A cooperation that they were not able to show any political dividend for. So already they entered it weakened, and in the initial phases, it seemed that President Abbas was hesitant, reactive, really was not seen as behaving like the president of the Palestinian people. And he got a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism from within his own political party, not only from the usual suspects in Hamas and PFLP, but from within Fatah itself. He seems, though, right now to be becoming more active and becoming the address for the ceasefire negotiations. And I think this is very much a result of a deliberate policy from Egypt. And he stands now, and he hopes to stand, to achieve 2 things. A role in concluding the deal, to show that he is the address. Okay. Which, by and large, is being achieved, but also possibly to establish a physical foothold in Gaza through deploying Palestinian PA forces in the Rafah area. 2 maybe just quick conclusions of what next, and it's not wise in our business to predict, but I will try to predict. In the short term, everyone's positioning for better terms in the deal, as I mentioned earlier. It's important, in my view, for any deal to include at least one component. To open up Gaza, because what's happening right now is not a result of, a random act. It's a result of the policy of closing Gaza. Gaza has to be opened up while continuing to isolate extremist elements, whether it's Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others. It's difficult, but it's not impossible, as we saw in the aftermath of the Neve Marmara incident. In the medium term, though, it seems to me that the three major players, the PA, Israel, and Hamas, are going to go through their internal, almost paralyzing transitions. And we have to ask ourselves, in the United States here, in policy terms, what is the best thing to do? Do we go again for a major peace deal, which seems to me to be more difficult, especially in light of Netanyahu's recent statements rejecting by and large the two-state solution? Or do we go for something that is more modest, that is more designed though to stabilize and push us a bit closer to a final deal?
Thank you very much, Ghaith. You have mentioned that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has fired his deputy for statements he made and the positions he took that are rather excessive, that could not be tolerated in Islam. But there is a statement, and you just mentioned it, that Mr. Netanyahu made publicly a couple of days ago that is strategically very disturbing. And to have said it in the middle of a conflict is particularly disturbing. I want to quote it and I want to read it so that I am quite accurate. I think the Israeli people understand now what I always say, that there cannot be a situation under any agreement in which we relinquish security control of the territory west of the Jordan River. That is quite troublesome, and it will haunt all of us beyond the present crisis, and we'll see. But my question to you, and you really had a rich presentation here, commend you for it, but specific question. The issue of the moment is the ceasefire, and Egypt has proven to be pivotal, even under the present circumstances where it has a myriad of issues to be concerned with internally and externally. Would you want to elaborate some more about its role right now in this crisis and beyond?
Okay, maybe I'll talk about the role and then the objectives that Egypt has in handling this. I think the role, in the general Arab world, of course, I'm not going to dwell much on it, but Egypt is a cornerstone. What happens in Cairo determines a lot what happens elsewhere in the Arab world. And so any attempt to ignore Egypt in any way, I think, is ill-advised, and any attempt to try to marginalize Egypt is ill-advised. In this specific context, Egypt is irreplaceable for facts of, the political weight of Egypt, but also for facts of geography. At the end of the day, Egypt is has a border with Gaza, the only Arab country that has a border with Gaza, and as such, anything and any move that Egypt is not fully on board on cannot be sustainable and cannot succeed. And equally, I would say any Palestinian factions, particularly here I'm talking about Hamas, why mask it? Any Palestinian faction that tries to bypass Egypt or try to blackmail Egypt is really playing with fire. Egypt has been a consistent and essential player and component of any future, of any Palestinian component of Palestinian politics, and I just don't see how it can be bypassed. What we're seeing today, frankly, is Hamas to a large extent paying a price of their posture against the new Egyptian government and their insistence to continue to push for the Muslim Brotherhood agenda. For Egypt, I think right now, there are a number of objectives as they engage this process. The first being, I think they want an end to the hostilities, driven in part by humanitarian considerations, in part by political considerations. The more that things get complicated, the more that the humanitarian situation worsens in Gaza, the more it will spill over into Egypt. It will spill over possibly security-wise, though that is less really pressing at the moment, but it will spill over politically. And while right now, by and large, the Egyptian public has not been animated about the issue, it's only a matter of time, and I think the real leaders in Egypt realize that. So the sooner that this is de-escalated, the more that you can bring stability to the immediate environs of Egypt, but also to Egypt itself. That's one. Two, also, they want a situation where the day after is you have a scenario that safeguards Egypt's national security. That's one of the main concerns when Egypt is addressed about the issue of Rafah. They do not want to have a situation where the day after they still have to deal with the continuum of terror jihadi organizations between Gaza and the Sinai. They do not want to deal with any of the above. So they want security guarantees on the borders that they can live with from the Palestinian side. Thirdly, I think Egypt is very aware of the point that I mentioned, the issue of diplomatic competition and who takes the lead, and are particularly concerned by the role of Turkey and Qatar, not only in the Gazan and in the attempt of these two countries to again own the Palestinian card, but also in the relations that they have with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and any elevation of their role will come at the expense of Egypt. These are, I think, to me, the main components that drive my understanding of Egyptian politics. Of course, one last point is they do have a vested interest in elevating the role of Abbas as the address for the Palestinians. And we've seen this being played out very proactively by them. And I think they take a lot of credit for the recent reactivation of the role of Palestinian officialdom.
Moving on to the regional landscape, no one alive would have possibly imagined 10 years ago the things that have unfolded across the Middle East. There are some 60 to 70 million people right now living in the Middle East in cases of war, hostility, and conflict across the borders and within states. Unimaginable, seemingly unconnected, but there has to be an explanation for what is happening, and all of it is certainly connected with, in one way or the other, with each other. You can no more isolate any issue or any state or any one single conflict and analyze it and resolve it alone in the Middle East without connecting it with what's happening elsewhere, because people have ways of sticking their fingers in every space that is open in the Middle East, and now there are so many open spaces. A most intriguing phenomenon that crossed the borders has been the non-state actors. They have established their own areas of control, including their own foreign policy. Yes. And that is, of course, an indication of the weakness of the existing regimes across the region affected, and would call into question what direction, around what values or notions will the new Middle East be built. To have this area covered in its connection with Palestine and in and of itself, we have a most distinguished presenter who is nationally and internationally known in his expertise, and who is a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine and is a dear friend. So Hussein.
Thank you, Ziad.
Hussein Ibish.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right about the complexity of the question. And so if I had 3 hours instead of 5 minutes, I'd probably try to give you something three-dimensional or even four-dimensional, but I can't. So I'm going to give you something reductive and two-dimensional. But let me just say, Ziad makes a very good point about the rise of non-state actors. 20 years ago, there was one major non-state actor in the Arab world with its own private army and its own foreign policy, and that was Hezbollah. And now there are at least 4 or 5 that qualify in that regard. Hamas has joined them. Now the so-called Islamic State, led by the new so-called self-appointed Caliph Mr. al-Baghdadi. We've got Ansar Sharia in parts of the northern Sahel and southern Sahara region, and other groups that I just won't list them all. But this business of non-state actors behaving like states, as if they were states, is truly troubling. And it certainly does help draw all of these things together, because they don't operate in a vacuum and they don't operate independently. They have backers, they have funders, they have interests, they have connections, they have ideological structures that inform them, and that's sort of crucial. So essentially what I want to do, apart from noting that there are a series of questions that are being asked of the entire Arab world and even the whole Middle East right now that are also reflected in the questions being asked of Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, what is your future? Where are you aligned? Where is all of this going? We're going to have to kind of be a little bit reductive here in looking at how the present flare-up in Gaza connects with these things. And essentially, I can draw you a kind of a general sort of a cross with 4 quadrangles. As a kind of, to be very reductive, there's essentially a pro-Muslim Brotherhood orientation versus an anti-Muslim Brotherhood orientation, and a pro-Iranian orientation versus an anti-Iranian orientation. Now, as I say, this gets very fuzzy at the edges, and I'll mention that. But that essentially, I think, more than any other factors, tends to define how regional factors are impacting the current hostilities. So and I think Ghaith made it quite clear that Egypt certainly sees Hamas and this conflict in terms of its own internal security problems and its conflict with the Muslim Brotherhood in that country. Its government and much of its population sees Hamas as unindicted co-conspirators in the unrest in the Sinai, in the terrorist activities, at the very least, of Ansar Beit al-Maqdis and perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood themselves. And in the spread of violence to Egypt's cities, joining them in that general attitude of being critical of the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore critical of Hamas, which after all is the Muslim Brotherhood Party of Palestine, are most of the Gulf states except Qatar, Jordan, and certainly I think to some extent at least the Palestinian Authority. On the other hand, you've got Turkey and Qatar, which were mentioned by Ghaith, but also some lesser actors as well, including some prominent political parties like Ennahda in Tunisia, for example, and other Islamist groups who tend to be more sympathetic to Hamas. Now, how this has played out, this brotherhood versus non-brotherhood thing, or anti-brotherhood thing, is really in terms of the ceasefire mediation, exactly that. So that the parties that are, not sympathetic to the Brotherhood have also been not sympathetic to Hamas, particularly, certainly not in the way that they would have been in earlier iterations of this conflict. And as Ghaith noted, Egypt's proposal was not designed to reward Hamas in particular. It offered them essentially calm for calm. And many of the other parties that I mentioned, the PA obviously does want to be involved and now increasingly is involved, but many of the others simply haven't gotten engaged in the way that they might have before. And you'll note an interesting lack of public outrage and governmental outrage in other parts of the Arab world. In the past, we would have seen a lot more anger, and there is some, and it's growing. But it's certainly not what it was before because of this context. For example, in Egypt, there is a palpable coolness towards Hamas, and not necessarily, certainly not towards the people of Gaza, but a willingness to consider that perhaps there is more than simply Israeli brutality and barbarism at work here, that perhaps there are other factors that are driving this that wouldn't have been taken into consideration before. Similarly, a desire to keep Turkey and Qatar from assuming that mediation role and supporting Egypt's efforts. Now, Qatar made a specific proposal that was essentially dismissed by virtually everyone except for Hamas. And Turkey also has gotten involved with saying that it wants to make proposals, but not actually making proposals. And being very rhetorically aggressive, accusing Israel of genocide, which is a very strong term for anything that resulted in the scandalous death of 200 people, but that usually few people would call that genocide. Well, Prime Minister Erdogan does, okay? And I think that reflects this division. So there is this competition going on here. And it's reflected also, I think, in internal divisions within Hamas that Ghaith alluded to. I think that there are elements within Hamas that are interested in opening doors with, say, the Egyptian government, interested in opening doors with some of the parties that have taken a very dim view of them since the overthrow of President Morsi. And they may actually be getting somewhere in the sense that if they don't sign off on a ceasefire, it's not going to happen. But how much of a political benefit they're going to get in terms of a ceasefire remains very much in question. It's going to be as little as Egypt and these other countries I mentioned can get them. And I don't think Turkey and Qatar are in a position to offer them much except moral support and maybe some money if they can get it. Now, moving on to Iran. Iran is the other major factor here, in my view. There are many others, but I'm just cutting it down to the bare bones. There is undoubtedly a division within Hamas that is more than a two-way division over relations with Iran. Hamas's relations with Iran were virtually, at least at the political level, were virtually shattered by the Syrian war, where Hamas's political wing, its Politburo, based in Damascus, had to choose between its alliance with Iran and the Bashar al-Assad regime on the one hand, and its identity as a core Muslim Brotherhood party on the other hand. And they could not but choose their core identity. Therefore, they had to leave Syria quickly, ignominiously, and without their property, or their money anyway, and look for other bases of support, both in terms of headquarters, which they have been unable to find a replacement for Damascus. They're spread out all over the place, and that weakens the Politburo as an institution, especially compared to their competitors, whether political leaders in Gaza or the military wing of Hamas. It diffuses them, and it makes them beholden to too many different sponsors and responsible to too many different interlocutors. It weakens it as an institution within Hamas. But it's also clear that the Hamas military wing, the Qassam brigades, never really broke completely with Iran the way that parts of the political bureau did, and that they have been successful in reaching out in recent months for greater engagement with Iran. So Iran's footprints can be seen here, not so much in terms of the specific weapons that are being used, which appear to be mostly homemade, but the expertise and some of the spare parts that Hamas has used to construct these rockets that clearly have a greater range. Without Iran's input, it's unlikely they would have been able to reach this level of independent let's say, production of weapons that have at least scared Israelis throughout Israel, even if they haven't been able to kill the number of Israelis they may have been hoping to. Now, in addition to that, during this period of tension between Iran and Hamas, the big winners in Gaza were the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which maintained great relations with Iran and continue to receive sophisticated rockets directly and have used them and have become significant rivals to Hamas in a way that they never were before the crisis in Syria. And that actually has extended itself to the creation by Iran of new smaller groups. There's one called Harakat Sabirin Nasran Philistine. It's small, it's shadowy, nobody knows much about it, but it's clearly directly a connection, an organization sort of that's an extension of the Pasdaran in the way that, almost in the way that Hezbollah is, and it's a new factor. So Iran is clearly looking for ways of getting in to Gaza again, and there are parts of Hamas that are enthusiastic about this, and there are parts of Hamas that worry about the reaction in Qatar, in Turkey, and indeed in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So I'd just like to close with one observation, which is that this space that's shut down for Hamas to be both a core Muslim Brotherhood party and an ally of Iran, this very strong sectarian divide that arose during what we call the Arab Spring sometimes, and particularly in the context of the Syrian war, may be challenged by a new development, and that is ISIS. okay, the rise of this so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq may be perceived as a threat almost equally or similarly, simultaneously at least, by enough Sunnis and enough pro-Iranian Shiites that this line starts to get blurred, and it becomes possible again to find a little bit of space to fudge that issue. I doubt it, but you have to, I think, take into consideration the potential impact that the rise of ISIS might have in softening that sectarian divide. Could, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran start to see eye to eye at some point on ISIS, and therefore the clear-cut binary divide start to erode? It's possible. I don't see any signs of it yet, but it's definitely possible. The last thing, of course, is on the immediate question of people dying, and here, as I said, there's a coolness towards Hamas that you see from governments and from certain publics, but there are diminishing returns in both directions. On the one hand, public opinion in a country like Egypt is starting to become very alarmed about the deaths and sufferings in Gaza. On the other hand, Hamas faces diminishing returns as well, because the more Gazans are killed and the more property is destroyed, the more they risk being blamed at the end of the day when the dust settles, at least 50-50 or something like that, at least taking a big share of the blame. And I'll close with this observation, which is that both in Palestinian terms and regionally, every time we've had this sort of conflagration, and there have been several, more people have put more blame on Hamas more quickly than the last time. So if this follows that pattern, whatever political benefit they get out of this might be limited and brief.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hussein. Very quickly, you haven't mentioned much about Syria, actually, where the death toll is probably 1,000-fold of what's happening in Palestine.
Yes.
Tragic as it is. The other issue that you have not mentioned, was not really in the domain of the question, but is worthy of a comment. How about Europe?
Right.
This is very relevant to Europe, and Tony Blair is there in attendance and actually helps with the formulation of the ceasefire plan. Can you just very, very briefly, please touch on those?
Well, I mean, Syria is not only a sort of, it stands as a great kind of example of how bad things really could get. The situation in Gaza is horrible, but you do have, yes, probably between 170,000 to 200,000 people dead at least in Syria in the past couple of years, and tens of millions of refugees and internally displaced. What that does is it makes use of the term genocide hard to support when that is rarely applied to the situation in Syria. And what it means, I think, what it shows, at least anyway, is that while this conflict, because it's so volatile and dangerous and horrible on its own terms, has taken center stage, it won't remain center stage. I mean, in a certain sense, Palestine, Syria and Iraq, the devastation and the rise of ISIS and whatnot, and the brutality of President Assad, sort of pushed Palestine, the issue of Palestine, to the margins. And I think that helps to explain the desperation of Hamas, which was characterized, I think, rather well by Ghaith, but also the sort of fight back that the PA in Ramallah has to make against its own, sort of apparent irrelevancy, and the irrelevancy of the issue of Palestine, which is only relevant because people are dying. And part of the reason for that is this huge war in Syria and another huge war in Iraq, but part of it is also a certain measure of, let's say, benign neglect or the lack of an extant diplomatic process and international engagement. That's where Europe comes in. Europe is very important. Europe has taken the lead in trying to bring home to Israelis a very important point, which is that there is a distinction between the legitimate internationally recognized state of Israel on the one hand and the illegitimate settlement project on the other hand, and its products and financing it. And that, I think, has given Europe a sort of a stronger edge here. It's, in my view, leading the way in trying to find a way to remind Israelis that there is a cost to the occupation and that there is an urgent need to resolve it. And I think also that, what's certainly very unfair when some people try to blame Secretary Kerry and his commendable efforts that did not succeed for this. On the other hand, when we don't have an extant negotiating process and we don't have a robust state and institution building or economic program on the ground in the West Bank, those Palestinians and Israelis and others who are committed to a negotiated agreement and a two-state solution find themselves greatly undermined. And then we end up in situations where violence rules the day, passions rule the day, and extremists seem to benefit.
Thank you. I have a question for the three of you, but not every one of you has to answer if you wish. The question is about our own policy. Almost a year ago, the United States started with a very ambitious program of resolving the final status issues within 9 months and ended up calling for a pause. And I think this new challenge now of an open warfare taking place presents serious questions to the policymakers of our country now. Please see if you can say a few words about where you see the government should go, this administration, and whether the public discourse is heading in the right direction or not about this issue.
Maybe I will build on what Hussein said. I think the first point is clearly the issue of neglect is not an option, because this Palestinian-Israeli issue has a way of reasserting itself, and often at very tragic cost. So for sure, something we have to continue getting engaged. The question is, how do we continue getting engaged? My view right now, and I think my sense is shared by some in the administration, that this might not be the time to go big. This might not be clearly, we had an attempt to have a peace deal and a peace agreement. This could not have failed to a large extent or to some extent because of the domestic politics of both sides. Well, after this episode, the domestic politics will be much more complicated. So the question is, what can you do short of major initiatives? And I think it will have to have two components. One regarding Gaza has to deal, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, with opening up Gaza. We've often mistakenly, I think, conflated isolating Hamas and isolating the terrorists with isolating Gaza and the Gazan population, and it's always backfired. It backfired during the Neve Marmara case, it backfired now, so that's one thing that needs to be dealt with immediately. And also, in doing so, maybe the issue of the National Accord government, the new one, could be an interesting construct to be used to reintroduce the PA into Gaza in a way that was not conceivable before this conflagration, but could be possible as an outcome of this current crisis. In the West Bank, I think one of the biggest victims in political terms of the last few months, of the last year maybe, is what Hussein referred to, the issue of the institution building project from the Palestinian side. We have seen a rolling back of some of the reforms that were put into place by Prime Minister Fayyad. And this was problematic not only because, these efforts were right in their own merit, but because right now, with the failure of the negotiations, the PA found itself with really nothing political to fall back onto. It couldn't deliver diplomatically, and it cannot deliver in governance-wise. So its political standing was greatly diminished. That's something for us from this country, to see how we can re-engage this issue. And finally, I think we have to start looking at the ground. The Palestinians have been consistently engaged with very robust security cooperation with Israel. One that, every IDF officer that I talk to says has been unprecedented. Yet so far, it has produced almost no political dividend for the Palestinians. opening those who engage in the security coordination to accusations of collaboration, etc., etc. And therefore, we have to look, can we use this security dynamic to start producing some changes on the ground that can come to the benefit of those who engage in it, not only in material terms, but in political terms, in ways that will allow the PA to credibly say that the security cooperation is actually part of the national liberation strategy.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, so excellent. That gives us time to open it up for questions. So please identify yourself as you ask, and it'd be highly preferable that it would be in the form of a question.
I think we have a microphone.
Yes, Dean, over there.
Is there a microphone?
There is.
Yes, behind you.
Oh, thank you.
Close.
I'm Dean Ahmed with the Minaret of Freedoms Institute, and I have a question. It's a factual question that perhaps Hussein can answer, but anyone who can answer it to answer it. I want to know, does anyone know what fraction of the rockets being launched from Gaza are actually being launched by Hamas as opposed to the other various factions that you mentioned?
Well, I think it's easy to answer. No, nobody does know. Well, they know. Okay, yes, they know. But I don't think anybody else does. One of the things that changed Monday before last is that Hamas started taking responsibility or credit, depending on how you want to look at it, for rocket attacks aimed in the general direction of southern Israel. And now, throughout Israel and in the occupied territories as well, since rockets fired from Hamas hit Hebron, which is not far, and Bethlehem, which is a little further, and other places. In some cases, there are joint claims of responsibility between Hamas and Islamic Jihad. In some cases, nobody claims responsibility. So we don't know. But I would say this, the Hamas paramilitary is much larger than any other paramilitary unit in Gaza. So you can bet that a very significant proportion comes from them. On the other hand, the ability and the capacity and capability of Islamic Jihad in particular is much greater today than it was 2 years ago or 4 years ago. And so their percentage will be significantly greater than it was in the past.
If I may just also comment on, the new development that we have seen is this joint claims of responsibility. This is something that is not usual. Hamas doesn't like to share credit traditionally. And to me, this shows a shift in the dynamic, in the power dynamic in Gaza, at least now, during the hostilities. It reflects a slight change with Islamic Jihad taking more prominent role, but yeah, I will keep an eye on that particular dynamic.
Okay.
Thank you, Howard Sumka. I'm going to take your challenge up, Ghaith, and make a prediction. I think it's going to look a lot after this ceasefire like it did after Operation Cast Lead and after Pillar of Smoke. In 2005, 2006, we had an EU monitoring mission that was supposed to control Rafah. It never could get in place because their facilities were blown up and then they could never deploy. We had Fatah security forces on the Israel-Gaza crossings, and they were routed in 2007 in the uprising that left Gaza in charge. During the whole Fayyad period, as you mentioned, there was no political payback for everything that Fayyad did, and there was no political framework in which that could happen. And so the things that are being proposed now by all of you and by others that I've read seem to be the same old, same old. And so the question is really very specific. I think that the reality is that Israel only listens to the U.S. In the end, Israel's the U.S. is the only country that's got leverage over Israel. And we don't take that leverage. We didn't insist on a political framework during the Fayyad state-building years. We had this self-defeating policy of trying to isolate and diminish Hamas by the siege on Gaza and by making the West Bank really a haven for people to have productive lives. Neither of those worked. We didn't make the West Bank so great, and we weren't able to control Gaza as well as we thought we could. what specifically do you think can happen now, whether it comes from the U.S. or it comes from the EU, that could keep us from repeating all of those failed policies and failed implementation efforts over that 6 or 7 year period?
Okay.
All right. I mean, I think, first of all, there are a few differences in this round from the previous rounds. One relates to Hamas itself. It is, I think, in a much weakened position than before. They tried to regain some of that. I doubt, to be honest, that they will be able to do that as a result of this operation. Though, and more importantly, as importantly, the issue of the splits within Hamas that I and Hussein mentioned. There's something very interesting going on in terms of those who want to build strong relations with Egypt versus those who want to build strong relations with Qatar, Turkey versus the domestic players. So there's a new dynamic in Hamas that actually is very much worth exploring and seeing how far it goes. The second one relates to Egypt itself. Egypt, I think, under Mubarak was only acted when there was a direct, immediate threat. They were by and large inactive. Then you had under Morsi a different kind of approach by Egypt. Now you have an Egypt that looks at the issue of Gaza in a much more serious way in terms of its own national security concerns, and not only as a one-off situation, but as an ongoing issue. So I can see some more happening from them. And the third one, which is frankly, so far it's been a construct, but it's been a useful one, is this National Accord government that can give a cover to some of the proposals being made. The issue, as you said, of deploying PA forces there, everyone's been talking about it since they were evicted, but this time it seems to be much more serious. The question is, how do we deal with these specifics? But by and large and more generally, it's really, I mean, the challenge, the biggest challenge is, which actually we didn't maybe enough deal with it, is that this doesn't happen in a political vacuum. It happens in a situation where the conflict continues. It happens in a situation where the credibility of a two-state solution and those who advocate for it continue to diminish. So the question for me right now that goes to American role in particular, what can we do to support them, to invigorate them, and to push forward the framework without overreaching? Because if we overreach and if we fail again, there is a price to be paid for that. So this is the calibration that I think we have to start looking at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, please. If I may just say something here to Howard. Howard was there at the time of the crisis. He was in charge of USAID for several years during the period we're talking about. Knows what he's talking about. Clearly, I think, Howard, you would probably support the fact that the whole idea of a state and institution building idea was a political program that perhaps was treated as a development program. This was an inspirational and aspirational program to come to the Palestinian people and tell them, you want a state, build it. You take responsibility and ownership of your state and build it from the ground up, and then turn to the rest of the world and say, how come we don't have a state? It really, frankly, under occupation, it borderlines genius that people would think of doing some such ambitious program and actually deliver for some time. It is very unfortunate from a political decision-making point of view, and I mean of the United States, that program received all the praise needed and possible to just sufficiently discredit it amongst the Palestinians as suspect and driven by the Americans and, stooges and spies, etc., while it really did deliver something substantive on the ground and was not sustained, and it just was blown away immediately by American political decisions when they went to the Security Council. Now, this is something that can be revisited. In fact, I think, regardless of what happens, people should not be allowed to live as the Palestinians do, either in the West Bank or in Gaza. I mean, this is unacceptable. I think, humanity is moving elsewhere. This business of isolating a people and treating them like second-class citizens, in your face second-class citizens, cannot be sustained. This brings us not just to political decision-making in the United States, it also brings us to the whole concept of deterrence in Israel, which has been really summed up in just a couple of phrases. The Palestinians should always remember who is boss, and if in case of doubt, kill them or build some settlement. That is the deterrence. Well, if I may suggest, humbly, if I may add, it hasn't worked, and it won't work, and it cannot possibly work. So a parallel track for the whole concept of deterrence in Israel has to let this new emerging criticism of the policy of imposing violence is to let the Palestinians prosper. Let the Palestinians really do build something on their land, even though you don't have to make a political decision right now. I think this is something we haven't discussed sufficiently about how Israel is viewing this conflict and how it could benefit, like the rest of us, from the lessons that have been imposed and reimposed on us. So, Hussein, you want to say something?
Yeah, except I'm just going to move back to the less, let's say, elevated realm of looking at how this would play out. I tend to think the way you do, that the new normal at the end of this will look a lot like the old normal, but because of the political changes that Ghaith outlined and that I talked about, that old normal is not really not acceptable to Hamas. It will be a crushing political defeat for them unless they are able to have some, what they're calling, to use a euphemism, a qualitative operation, something very sanguineous regarding Israelis. And that doesn't seem to be likely. So it would appear that it would appear essential for Hamas to be a little bit different than the old normal, because the old normal, as it's been for the past year, has been a desperate box for them. And I think one of the reasons we're in this situation is that they're trying to do anything they can to get out of it. And so far, they haven't found anyone tossing them anything that they can claim as a benefit. But that may change now. Who knows?
Just want to respond more generally for very basic things. The president's role is essential. Elections are coming up, but also his term is winding down to 2016. If he doesn't do it, I don't know what president will do it, given his knowledge of the area and his empathy with Israel and with the Palestinians. Secondly, there is a lot of need for education, educating Americans, educating Israelis, educating Palestinians, a lot of ignorance as to what is actually happening. It seems that American Jews know more about Israel, they think, than the Israelis. American Arabs know more about Palestinians than the Palestinians. And this is unacceptable because it is leading to wrong or to at least half-baked policies that need to be fixed. Another one is the United States, it is in its best interest to support the moderate elements in Israel and in Palestine. A lot of monies are being wasted on projects and on armaments that really are not building an infrastructure, the young people to grow up to know their history and to appreciate the other. And lastly, the United States can do a great deal internally in this country in terms of educating members of Congress, but educating the American public in general and calling for dialogue and cooperation between Arab Americans and Jewish Americans so that they become advocates of a two-state solution.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Right behind you.
Right behind you.
My name is Art Hughes of Middle East Institute and Foundation for Middle East Peace. Thank you very much for this presentation today. Very illuminating. It seems to me there are two really fundamental problems trying to move things ahead. One is, of course, there is no military solution. There is no solution by force. You've touched on this, Ziad. So does this mean that the Israelis might review their policies and their deterrent systems are not working either? Question. The other fundamental problem is that the present people in charge of the political process in Israel don't really believe in a two-state solution, don't want a two-state solution. So what options does that leave available for the Palestinians? And a part of that, a subset of that, of course, is the Americans tried and failed and are not going to be able to do anything meaningful, I don't think, for a good while. So what other options are there available for the Palestinians? What about the UN again or something? But I'd be interested in your comments on that. Thank you very much.
All fair questions. Who wants to take that first?
Sure. Israeli deterrence. I mean, look, first of all, I would argue that what was very interesting in this round of hostilities is actually military technology has actually worked to stabilize some of the, I mean, the Iron Dome. It's a very interesting, the success rate of the Iron Dome that we have seen, and not only the success rate in terms of the percentages, but the qualitative ability to deal with certain kind of threats. This is interesting, and this does change a new, I mean, that's one of the reasons, frankly, why I think Israel has not felt the need to go in from on the ground, and why Hamas so far is scrambling to find a way to create this qualitative deterrence, as they would call it. So I wouldn't dismiss the security component, whether in terms of the real threat that there is to Israeli security, of course, the real threat to the Palestinian civilian security in Gaza and elsewhere. It's still a component that I would look at. Let's see how things will end after this one, because I do think that we will see a different dynamic in terms of deterrence specifically as we look at it. In terms of the Palestinian options, to be honest, there are not many at the moment. And I think we have to start moving away from the view of peace as this spectacular moment of a handshake on the South Lawn or something like that, which clearly is not going to happen. What other options do they have? I think we have to look at more what domestic options that they have. There are many issues internally for the Palestinians that they have to deal with in terms of the polity and where it's going, and some of the fraying that we see. You know, it's interesting if you look at Palestinian opinion polls that, you know, maybe Palestinians prefer Fatah a bit more than Hamas or vice versa, but most of them do not trust either party. There is a lot of internal building that needs to be done to be able to create a foreign policy that is comprehensive. The UN, it's illuminating that Abbas has not gone to the UN yet, despite many of the pressures that he has internally, because I think he realizes this is a double-edged sword whose utility is limited at the end of the day. He knows that it will put him in a head-on course with the US administration, and this is a relationship that he does not want to sacrifice. He knows that the political dividend for that is very short-lived, as seen from the previous approach to the UN. You'll get a week of spike in popularity that will then evaporate when there's no real change on the ground. So that doesn't, to me, seem like an integrated, it might be a way of venting frustration, but it's not an integrated approach. So I think right now, before you start talking about an integrated approach, you need to start talking about how do you rebuild credibility for Palestinian leadership. I think the elevated role that Abbas is getting right now in the ceasefire could give him some space to start engaging in what he should have engaged in earlier in terms of governance, in terms of opening up the political space and looking at how do you rebuild a national political consensus in Palestine.
I think it is important not to presume to speak for the Palestinians. Everybody's legitimacy, of course, right now is in question. The last election they had was 2005 and then 2006 for the Legislative Council. And, you know, it's kind of disturbing, certainly to me, that everybody asks for democracy everywhere else in the Middle East and voting in elections except in Palestine. Well, perhaps there is an answer amongst the Palestinian people as to what it is that they want. And that should apply equally in Gaza as it would in the United States. Now, judging by the balance of powers, the people in charge of the system in both these entities have little desire to change the status quo because they're in charge. But there is a way to make this thing happen, and that way is by the international community. And I don't mean this loosely or in some kind of an ambiguous way. I mean it in terms of funding. The Palestinians get funding every month from the international community. Those who lend this money, no, just give this money, okay, have it within their power to say, open up the political space. You know, we advocate for democracy globally, and you know what? We want to advocate for it in Palestine. If they're afraid of Hamas, they have the option of not funding whoever wins eventually. Okay, but opening up the political space is way beyond elections. If you declare elections in 2 months, it's going to be a contest between the usual suspects. Open up the political space to start a campaign in preparation for elections. A protracted campaign with ideas contested, with personalities tested, with individuals exposing themselves to answering real questions and being accountable for, like you do everywhere else. This takes time. I think if the international community wants to be useful and serious about this issue, it has that option. And to me, it is a test of the seriousness of the commitment of the international community to the political development that leads to some kind of a meaningful parity of communication between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
I mean, if I may add, though, this can only happen in a context where also Israel seizes some of the excesses that it engages in, whether in settlement expansion, whether in terms of allowing the space for this kind of development within the Palestinians. And this is where the Palestinians can use the frankly improved relations that they have with the U.S. administration to start pushing for a more, maybe humble, but maybe more concrete policy in terms of the ground.
Okay.
There. Yeah. No,
behind you.
Sorry, Ross Anthony from RAND. I want to follow up on that to some extent because I wonder what you think this might do in terms of the Israelis pursuing what's been called unilateral withdrawal, whether it's coordinated or uncoordinated, which is kind of the flip side of, because you can certainly make a case that the political process there will cause it to move that direction. And just one other quick point. To me, the United States, we always say United States, but obviously we know this is a mostly very divided place with lots of limitations on the president. I probably don't have to tell you that.
Well, my question, though, is when you say unilateral withdrawal, do you mean also unilateral annexation? I mean, because ideas about unilateral withdrawal in Israel are generally joined at the hip with the idea about also de facto or de jure unilateral annexation. So obviously anything like that would be quite disastrous. I would say this. There are lots of kinds of unilateral measures that can be taken by both sides that are helpful, and lots of things Israel can do in terms of access and mobility, the ability of the PA to operate in Area C, and beyond that in H2, as we saw the other day, at least in terms of drug enforcement, which was, sort of extraordinary in a certain sense. Or on the contrary, the tightening, clamping down. And these are very different. But what we've seen in the past is that unilateral withdrawals, which are done by Israel for its own convenience and in time and manner of its own choosing, without anyone on the other side having a stake in making it work, don't generally benefit the situation on the ground. And so we can contrast the consequences of Israel's unilateral withdrawal from southern Lebanon, unilateral withdrawal or the redeployment from Gaza. It wasn't a withdrawal, but it's a redeployment, etc., with the peace treaties that were negotiated with Jordan and Egypt, or even the armistice with Syria, where there's an interest on the other side, or the agreements with the Palestinian Authority that also have generally held. My point is this: Israelis are sort of in this mindset of unilateralism, and they think they can either dictate. Many of them, I don't want to generalize too much, but many of them think they can either use their enormous asymmetry of power to dictate new realities unilaterally, and it'll be okay. And we know, I think, from those examples that that's not how these things play out. Or they think that it's sort of there's no prospect of a mutual agreement because of the consequences of former unilateral actions. What I think needs to be understood is that the track record of agreements between Israel and Arabs is excellent, and the track record of unilateral actions by Israel is equally impressive, but in a negative way. So what that means is most of what you do, particularly in terms of changing the fundamental strategic equation on the ground, needs to be coordinated and probably negotiated.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. Again, tying several questions together. I know from all I read, but also speaking to friends and family back home, that extremism is on the rise in both Israel and in Palestine. And there is a certain subculture that if you are powerful, you get what you need and what you want. And whether it has to do with land ownership or it has to do with taking the law into your own hand because somebody called you a name or something like that. It happens all the time on the West Bank, in Jerusalem and in Israel. The stronger party has its say and the weak just have to surrender or just go away. And this type of mentality has to change at the basis of everything that is being stated here. There is a moral obligation that we have towards the other. And I know the difference between pragmatism and principle and so on. But there is a moral obligation that the Israeli people have to ask themselves the question, am I going to oppress the other? The Palestinians have to ask the question, am I going to ignore the other and oppress the other in a different way? They have to come to the realization that they are neighbors forever. No matter what happens, the people between the river and the sea are neighbors. And the quicker they get to that realization, the better they are. So the upper hand of Israel, with all its military and all its technology, it's not giving it more security, and it has been waiting for that security since 1948. What would bring it security? Bringing security is embracing the other. And I'm not talking just hugging, it's being very practical. Job creation, stop of confiscation of land, permits to travel freely, educating people on both sides of the boundary, bringing Jews and Palestinians together for dialogue and for breaking bread. Those things might sound superficial, but they are really important to transform lives. I do not believe that an Israeli or a Palestinian in his right or her right mind would want to oppress the other. And that's something that the Prime Minister, the President, and others have to realize and start working for that. Invest in the youth, invest in the future, bring us together to talk about these things. And these issues are very tough. They are building up. And as you peel the onion, you might be crying, but that has to happen to bring us to the light, which is all we seek.
In its extreme form, this takes the shape of you first devalue them and then you kill them. Mm-hmm. And this is frankly, the public space, the public discourse is full of devaluing the other everywhere. Dehumanize them, and then you can kill them. In fact, perhaps the Israelis suffer less from the consequences of this disastrous view of life because they do have an open system. They do have an open system and a government that can be checked. But dissenting towards moderation in the Middle East in general has fewer sponsors than in other places in the world. And it is a hardship, in fact, everywhere. So those of us who are not in government, at least we can do that.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Oh yeah. Sorry. No. I'm sorry. No. Yeah, the lady over there. Pardon me.
Thank you, Leandra Bernstein, Ria Novosti. This is a question about Palestinian statehood, and Tony Blair was mentioned as part of the quartet. You also have a number of U.S. administrations who have really followed the line of Tony Blair, which his doctrine is a post-Westphalian system. Now, based on U.S. military experts, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, deterrence is far easier with a state rather than a non-state actor. So it would seem very counterintuitive not to be establishing states, but instead decentralizing them. What we did in Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, what is ongoing in the Middle East. So how do you handle that broader question? And I don't mean to throw yet another problem onto your table, because it's not a big enough table.
That's exactly what
it's long.
But you know, I mean, I think to some extent we tend to blame the U.S. for too much and ascribe too much power to the U.S. I mean, what we are seeing in the ground is some of them are really homegrown problems that, frankly, the Arab world has to deal with itself. But I think specifically one of the issues that have personally interested me for a long time is the issue: how do you have statehood without control over the means of violence? How can you do that? This is why I think the security sector reform that we have seen in the Palestinian institution building project was core and was key. And that's why I was concerned when we had a national accord deal that did not deal with the issue of Hamas's militias and military assets. I think this is one of the issues that we have to look at as we look at the region, is what is the role of the security sector, and how do you do these kind of things, not only in a technical point of view, but through the creation of the framework of the state and the constitutional frameworks that you need to build this relation between citizen and state. And that's the general statement.
Yeah. In addition to which, I think that dovetails perfectly with my point about unilateralism. There has to be not only a mutuality, an agreement, there has to be a clear address on the other side. So here's the interesting thing. Statehood is no longer synonymous with a monopoly on the use of force. In theory it is, but you can see examples in both directions. I mean, clearly not true in Lebanon, in Libya, in Iraq, and in Syria. There are groups and even regions that take their own decisions and do what they want. And it's not true among the Palestinians either. On the other hand, the KRG and Kosovo are, it seems to me, states without being states. States without being, certainly in the case of the KRG, without even asserting its independence, and in the case of Kosovo, without any hope of ever getting into the United Nations and several other key multinational institutions. So in a certain sense, it's an independent state nominally within Serbia for the foreseeable future. So this theoretical synonymity between or synchronicity between monopoly on the use of force and theoretical statehood has been broken, is absolutely shattered, in my opinion, in both directions. And it creates no end of problems. And so that's why these security sector reforms were so crucial for Palestinians, and they were the sine qua non for everything else that was done under the state and institution building program. And I mean, to go back to the question, what are Palestinian options? I mean, begin by going back to that. And what can the international community do? Begin by going back to funding it again. And as Ziad said, insisting on it. And I mean, it was tried, and it proved to be very effective in making things better. Was it the solution? No. But was it a huge improvement? Yes, it was. So abandoning it, walking away from it, makes no sense for anybody, I think. And it goes directly to your question.
Yeah, there is another thing altogether, which we would have to tie what's happening now with what happened in the Arab Spring as it started. It was a rebellion about bad governance.
Right.
That's what it was. It was bad governance. Nobody mentioned imperialism or America or Israel or anything of the sort. It managed to take shape in the Middle East by the oldest forms of bias and empowerment, which is religion and tribalism and the most primitive bonds. And the real conversation about the values that should drive a real revolution is about values: citizenship, universal rights, government responsibility and accountability and term limits, etc., constitutions. This is now taking place across the board. In Palestine, you have to take an exception because Palestine is under occupation. So in a very funny way, what we have is an occupying power that is asking the occupied to provide its security endlessly. Now, because the Palestinians were in a weak position and they had tried everything else, they accepted this. Believe it or not, they accepted it with the clear promise that there be a light under the end of the tunnel, which is a state. That was the premise of Oslo, with 5 years. That was the premise of the State and Institution Building Program, was supposed to be time limited. And at the end, there was nothing. Now, you cannot continue providing that kind of security and safety, no matter how oppressive the government is, and it will try to control things. It cannot sustain this. It's the same principle that is what is happening in everywhere, Syria, Gaza. There has to be a government that actually takes care of its people, okay? And you cannot trust it, and you have to trust the instruments of governance elsewhere, which are constitutions and laws, etc., etc. This, I think, is the larger fight. The specific fight right now in Palestine is to reason with the Israelis. I welcome the debate that started in Israel. And it is a real healthy debate. And it's not from the tree huggers and the peaceniks, etc. It is also the hardcore strategists of Israel who are in the security sector, in the intelligence sector, in charge of its wars and pay the consequences of these wars because it's their country and they want to protect it. This is where more dialogue is needed, both within Israel, within Palestine, and across. And in fact, this is now a dialogue across the region, not just with the Palestinians. I think this would, under at least the best of expectations and hopes, what's happening now is going to be a lesson. No matter how much resistance there is going to be, that this whole idea of deterrence as it existed up till now in Israel, well, it's just not working. Maybe we should try and have another level of communication. Well, I suspect, and I know it has started, by the way, and I think the Egyptians are a perfect example of people who are playing this role. More power to them. Yes, sir.
I have to apologize. I have to take my leave.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
My name is Tom Getman. I'm an NGO executive. I served for 5 years in the Middle East and realized that the status quo people want to go back to wasn't so great as what we have now. It was no greater in many ways. And I have a functional question first. Is there going to be a DVD available that we can have to share with others that weren't able to be here?
It'll be online.
The answer is yes.
Online.
Yeah,
okay.
online.
And secondly,
so we can be held accountable for what we say.
No, well, that too. There is a mood shift that's apparent, and the producer of Just Vision was on one of the conference calls the other day, and she said that media is the first step to movement building. And some of the films they've done have been terrific, speaking to the points you two have just made. Secondly, Jewish Voices for Peace has 40,000 members, a number of them pulpit rabbis. Wilson Center said the other day, Aaron Miller said occupation is the core issue. Until we take care of that and the siege of Gaza, there will be no progress. AJC just had a seminar over the telephone for its members that raised the ethics of the sort of military force the Israelis are using, the moral problems that the use of military is. So in discussing the issue of the role of the United States, you made no mention of the 1 million missing Jews that have left Israel because they're so damn frustrated with it. But have influence in Europe and the United States. What is the role of your friends in the progressive Judaism movement that will elucidate what we're talking about today?
Okay. Well, this is an organizational problem in a sense, so I might take it. We are for a two-state solution, very clearly. We think because it's the only solution, and others are options to continue the conflict in other means. If you are interested in the solution, this gives everybody something. Nobody will be satisfied, but everybody will have their own home. The Palestinians, for the first time, would be first-class citizens somewhere. And the Israelis, whatever their religion is, they will have their state to do with it whatever they please, and the region will accept that. That is why it has so much to offer at the other end. It is disheartening to the extreme to see the degree of the resistance to it and the veto power that folks have against it. But nevertheless, the struggle continues. Now, on that basis, we establish relations with everybody and anybody who is remotely associated with the two-state solution. And we have made a policy decision not to take sides amongst Jewish organizations. We have enough problems as it is, and you know, they can have their own policies and whatever it is, but we communicate with them, all organizations that are interested in a two-state solution, and having a conversation about that. And we do not accept the labels that are generally bandied about, how to divide people. No, I think there is a great deal of interest in two-state solution. In fact, every survey we read amongst American Jewish communities points to a 70% support for a two-state solution. Now that's a high percentage, and for us to fail to communicate openly and in public, the challenge is the openly and public part, because everybody talks to everybody under the table. No, this discourse has to take place publicly, and we paid the price. We continue paying the price, and we will continue paying the price for being open about this, the need to have serious communications between Palestinians and Arabs on the one hand, and Muslims, and the Jews, and the Israelis, and the Zionists. This is a dialogue that's necessary. At the end of the day, these are the people who will settle this, if it's ever going to be settled. And you just don't talk to people on the moon about it. So we are American citizens. Now, there is no limit about who we can talk to, what we talk about. There is no penalty. Nobody's going to pick you up at 2 in the morning and send you to some kind of a disappearing place. So we take full advantage of being first class American citizens. And we are audacious enough to define the American interest. Imagine Palestinian Americans daring define the national American interest. Yes, we dare. Like everybody else, because we are no better than anybody else and no worse than anybody else. And in our view, and it happens to be the truth that we believe in, that the two-state solution is in the national interest of the United States, our country. So on that basis, we talk to everybody as equals, as friends. Now, Howard and I are friends. And I mean, really, we are friends. I hope you... Yeah. Okay. We've talked about this issue, repeatedly. There is very little space in between us, and there are so many others that can, augment on this, and we have to be public about what we do. People in government have their own constraints. What are ours? Okay. A little courage here and there, and put up with the fact that you have a series of adjectives attached to you that are not entirely complimentary. Nevertheless, I think this is something that can be done and should be done. And I dare say that the space already exists. The space already exists that has been occupied by what I like to call reasonable people who think more of the future than they dwell in the past.
Are there Jewish people that have influence on Bibi, because he's doing everything he can to...
Okay, let's put it this way. We talk to Israeli officials. We talk to Israeli non-officials, opinion makers, and ordinary citizens. We talk to Israeli officials who are close to the prime minister, and we talk to some who claim that they are close to them. It doesn't matter to us, okay? But what we say is the same. What we say is the same. Two states, just let's respect each other's humanity and pride and dignity and make a deal. Otherwise, leave it to the others. There are enough of them.
Yep. I just want to affirm what Ziad has mentioned. It is so simple, and yet everybody doesn't see it. It is the real thing that will bring about justice. And for us, and this is written on the ATFP website, our concept of a state of Palestine is one that is democratic, pluralistic, non-militarized, and neutral. It is in the best interest of the Palestinians to choose such a course. It is in the best interest of Israel to recognize the need, enough is enough, that people after 47 years or even after 100 years have to feel at home. And this is the home that they all share, and they have to come close to it. So the organizations you mentioned, you know, Just Vision, AJC, and Jewish Voices for Peace and others, there are about 70 such organizations out there. And there needs to be a way to join hands, and while we have disagreements, or while we do not have full agreement on all issues, yet we have common objective, which is to bring security and peace and prosperity to that part of the world.
Well, the professor has just talked the last words. Oh. So we thank you, Professor Hussein.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for attending and contributing.